The Canadian Rocky Mountains in winter are one of the harshest places on the planet. Temperatures can drop as low as minus 40 degrees Celsius, and hurricane-force winds of up to 120 kilometers per hour can knock out even the most experienced hiker. These majestic mountain ranges stretching across Alberta are full of death traps. Treacherously slippery slopes, sudden snowstorms, and no quick escape. The story we tell today will prove that even the best trained professionals can find themselves in a fight for life with the merciless nature. This is a story about the power of the human spirit and how one moment can change a person's fate forever. The morning of January 8th, 2008 was particularly frosty in the Alberta mountains. The thermometer read minus 20 degrees Celsius, and gusty winds of up to 25 meters per second were blowing drizzle across the snow-covered slopes of the Rocky Mountains. In this part of Canada, near the town of Coleman, the massive Whaleback Range towers over the valleys, creating a natural barrier between the provinces of Alberta and British Columbia. The terrain around Bob's Creek is a complex weave of steep slopes and deep valleys. At about 2,000 meters above sea level, vegetation thins, giving way to rocky scree and open plateaus. In winter, this harsh landscape becomes even more impregnable. Snowdrifts mask dangerous slopes, and strong wind makes movement much more difficult. On this day, visibility was relatively good, although wind gusts occasionally kicked up a dusting of snow into the air. The road leading to the Bob's Creek trailhead parking lot was nearly deserted. Few people ventured deeper into the mountains in this weather. It was in these harsh conditions that 56-year-old Ken Hildebrand, a professional trapper with 35 years of experience, worked. As a registered trapper with the Alberta Fish and Wildlife Service, he was engaged in the important task of regulating a beaver population whose uncontrolled activities could lead to the flooding of hundreds of acres of land and disruption of the local ecosystem. He had an impressive record of wilderness survival, complemented by his work as a paramedic for a rescue service. His colleagues jokingly referred to him as Mr. Gadget for his habit of always carrying an extensive first aid kit. His camping kit could provide for about 15 people. Few people knew that Ken suffered polio as a child, spending 18 months in an iron lung known as a negative pressure ventilator. The disease left a mark. His left leg was 10 centimeters shorter than his right, resulting in a noticeable limp. However, this did not prevent him from becoming one of the most experienced trappers in the region, known for his meticulous preparation for going out on the route and his ability to cope with any difficulties. At dawn, Ken set about meticulously preparing his gear. His Yamaha Grizzly 700 required special attention. The ATV was to be loaded with extra fuel, gear, and all systems checked before the challenging route. In extremely cold temperatures, even a small technical fault could be critical. After loading the ATV onto the pickup truck and placing the necessary gear, Ken was ready to go. In his arsenal were an extended first aid kit for working in the wilderness, an axe, a multi-tool, extra fuel, a compass, and a signal whistle on a lanyard, the mandatory elements of his equipment. In case of an emergency, he had bright orange signal tapes that could attract the attention of rescuers. The plan was to drive the pickup truck to a certain point, from where the more difficult part of the journey began, and then switch to an ATV. The route on the ATV was through challenging mountainous terrain, from Black Mountain through Breeding Valley, on through Whaleback to Bob's Creek, covering about 18 kilometers of rugged terrain. Around 7 a.m., Ken hit the road. After 2 hours of driving the pickup truck, he reached the point where he was to transfer to the ATV. Here, at about 2,000 meters above sea level, the wind picked up and the temperature dropped even lower. Wind gusts of 25 meters per second made it difficult to control the heavy Yamaha Grizzly 700. We had to move with special care. The total weight of the ATV with a load reached 450 kilograms. At such an altitude, where trees did not protect from the wind, even an experienced driver could not maintain a speed higher than 20 kilometers per hour. The route passed through numerous streams and steep slopes, requiring constant attention and precision in steering. By 2 p.m., Ken had reached his trapper line in the Bob's Creek area. The trap check was successful. 5 beavers had been harvested and were to be transported back. After securing the prey on the ATV, he began the return trip. The most difficult part of the route was the descent down a steep mountain slope, where gusty winds posed a particular danger. Around 3:30 in the afternoon, Ken started down the steep slope. The heavy ATV, loaded with gear and loot, required special care and steering. On a steep slope with such weight, even a small mistake could lead to loss of control. Strong side winds of up to 25 meters per second created additional difficulties in maneuvering. At one corner, Ken momentarily lost control of his Yamaha Grizzly 700. While attempting to level the handlebars on a slippery section, the ATV began to roll onto its side. The total weight of 450 kilograms played a fatal role. The machine completely overturned, pressing Ken to the frozen ground. The impact was severe. The metal frame of the ATV and the trunk loaded with gear collapsed onto his right leg and lower back. The wheel pressed his foot into the ground, breaking his tibia and fibula. The muscles in his lower leg were severely damaged. The rim of the wheel had cut deeply into the tissue. Ken was face down on the ground, made worse by the fact that the gusty wind was now hitting him in the face, picking up fine particles of soil and snow. In this situation, his chances of survival depended largely on his ability to quickly free himself from under the heavy machine. However, all of his gear, including communications and basic tools, was in the ATV's cases, which were impossible to reach. The only items left at Ken's disposal were the ones he was wearing directly: a compass, whistle, and lighter on a lanyard around his neck, a multi-tool in his pocket, and several pieces of bright orange signal tape. Ken spent the first few minutes after the accident assessing his condition. Despite the shock, his medical training helped keep his mind clear. The broken leg wasn't hurting badly yet. His body was in shock, but Ken realized it was temporary. Breathing was difficult due to the pressure on his back, but vital organs did not seem to be affected. The first attempt to save himself was the use of an axe, which happened to be within reach. Using his neck lanyard with compass and whistle, Ken managed to pull the handle of the axe towards him. The plan was simple: use it as leverage between the frame of the ATV and the trunk to create a gap and get out. However, the weight of the machine proved to be too much. The axe handle cracked and broke, depriving Ken of one of his most important rescue tools. Being only 600 yards from the Bob's Creek hiking trail parking lot and about a kilometer from the nearest ranch, Ken began signaling for help. He used a whistle, emitting 3 consecutive signals, the International Distress Code. The sound traveled up the valley, but the strong winds drowned it out. Attempts to shout also proved futile. Realizing that no quick rescue was imminent, Ken began to prepare for long-term survival. Using bright orange tape, he created a conspicuous X-shaped signal sign in the snow in front of him. In case a search helicopter appeared, this could attract the attention of rescuers. The temperature continued to drop, and Ken realized that his main enemy was the cold. His body, pressed against the frozen ground, was beginning to lose heat rapidly. As night fell, the temperature dropped even lower. Ken's body, pressed against the frozen ground, began to cool rapidly. The first sign of developing hypothermia was severe shivering. Ken knew that at minus 20 degrees Celsius and gusty winds, he had only a few hours before hypothermia would become critical. He forced himself to constantly move loose body parts in an attempt to retain some warmth. Adding to the hypothermia problem was dehydration. Ken had no access to water or snow. The heavy ATV had completely immobilized him, leaving only limited freedom of movement of his head and arms. Within reach were 2 carcasses of prey beavers. After hours of work with a multi-tool, Ken was able to partially carve them and use them as additional protection from the cold. The first night brought a new threat: the sounds of approaching predators. Coyotes lived in the area, and the smell of fresh prey was bound to attract their attention. Ken periodically used a whistle and banged the remains of his axe on metal parts of the ATV in an attempt to scare the animals away. This tactic proved effective. The predators did not risk approaching the source of the loud noise. By the morning of the second day, Ken's body had entered the dangerous phase of hypothermia. The shivering had stopped, indicating that his body was no longer fighting the cold. He was deliberately forcing himself to shiver, trying to generate some heat. Dehydration was becoming an increasingly serious problem. While in a stationary position, Ken could reach up and gather some snow around him, slowly melting it in his mouth. This process was ineffective. The cold snow further lowered his body temperature, and the amount of moisture he received was minimal. By the third day of being under the overturned ATV, Ken's condition had deteriorated significantly. Over 48 hours without food and with minimal water had resulted in severe exhaustion. His broken leg, permanently pinned by the metal rim of the wheel, had almost lost sensation. Based on his medical experience, Ken realized that prolonged impaired circulation could have irreversible consequences. Severe dehydration was beginning to affect consciousness. Periods of clear thinking were followed by confusion. Constant hypothermia was forcing the body to work at its maximum capacity. Ken continued to fight drowsiness, realizing that sleep under these conditions could be fatal. Every half hour he forced himself to move every available part of his body, trying to keep the blood flowing. On the fourth day, for the first time, the weather began to change. The wind had died down a bit and the temperature had risen slightly. However, the improvement in weather conditions could not change the situation dramatically. Ken's body was at its limit. The periods of forgetfulness were getting longer and longer. Using what little strength he had left, he continued to blow his whistle regularly, although the hope that someone would hear him in this remote area was becoming more and more elusive. Around 2 p.m. on January 11, the fourth day after the accident, the weather finally improved. The wind died down and the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in ages. At that moment, Ken, semi-conscious from exhaustion and hypothermia, heard a dog barking approaching. The sound was different from the ones that had been coming from the distant ranch all those days. It was closer and clearer. Soon an elderly man and his dog showed up. Noticing the overturned ATV, he at first mistook the motionless figure beneath it for a dead man, but when Ken moved, the stranger quickly approached. "I'm Mike," he introduced himself, kneeling down next to the ATV. "Hang in there, kid. I'm gonna help you." Ken, despite his critical condition, maintained clarity of thought. "The ATV weighs about 450 pounds. We need to lift it enough so I can crawl out, but we have to do it carefully. My leg is broken." The first attempt to lift the heavy machine was unsuccessful. One man's strength was not enough. So they changed tactics. Mike concentrated on moving and lifting the ATV slightly on one side. This allowed Ken to partially free his right leg, which was most seriously injured. Once he had some freedom of movement, he was able to help on his next attempt by resting his healthy leg and arms. "Now let's go together, on the count of 3, Ken coordinated. With their combined efforts, they managed to lift the Yamaha Grizzly 700 enough for Ken to get out from under it completely. Mike, wasting no time, covered Ken with his jacket and headed to the nearest ranch to call for medical help. Left alone, Ken finally had access to his gear. Despite his severe exhaustion, his paramedic skills helped him assess the situation correctly. The first thing he did was to get some materials from his first aid kit to immobilize his broken leg and apply a splint. There was still frozen coffee in the thermos that had been in the trunk of the ATV the whole time. Slowly sipping the half-frozen beverage and eating a few energy bars from the supplies, Ken tried to keep his body temperature from drastically changing. Soon, Mike returned in his pickup truck, along with 2 men from a nearby ranch. They helped Ken into the back of the vehicle, where blankets had already been prepared. The transportation over the rough mountain road took about half an hour until they reached Highway 22, where an ambulance crew was already waiting for them. The paramedics immediately began administering emergency care. Ken's condition was critical: severe hypothermia, dehydration, and traumatic shock. A preliminary examination of his right leg raised serious concerns. The prolonged disruption of blood supply had caused severe tissue damage. In conditions of low temperature, it partially slowed down the development of necrosis, but the situation was still critical. The ambulance crew immediately started intravenous infusions to combat dehydration and stabilize his condition. Ken was urgently transported to a nearby hospital where a medical team was waiting for him, ready to perform emergency surgery. At the hospital, doctors immediately realized the seriousness of the situation. 4 days with a crushed limb and severe frostbite led to the development of gangrene. Despite all the efforts of the doctors, Ken's right leg could not be saved completely. Each operation gave hope, but the gangrene continued to spread, requiring more and more amputations. It took 3 consecutive surgeries, going higher and higher until healthy tissue could be reached. For a man who had struggled all his life with the effects of polio, this was a daunting experience. Ironically, Ken had now lost his good leg, the one that had been compensating for the weakness of his polio-affected left leg all these years. In the intensive care unit, he often thought back to his childhood in the hospital, when at age 6 the doctors said he would never walk. Then he proved them wrong. Now, 50 years later, history was repeating itself. Once again, the doctors doubted his ability to move on his own. But the same spirit that had helped him survive 4 days under an overturned ATV was now giving him the strength to recover. By the end of March, after much wrangling with doctors and a demonstration of incredible willpower, Ken was allowed to begin a rehabilitation program with a prosthesis. Every step was difficult. The weakened left leg had to learn to take his body weight, while the right side with the prosthesis regained mobility. Months of hard training became its own survival story. Ken was relearning simple movements he used to perform without thinking. Now even climbing the stairs was a small victory. With the help of a cane, perseverance, and the support of his family, he was gradually returning to normalcy, although normal would never be the same again. This ordeal changed not only his body, but also his outlook on life. Ken began visiting schools where he taught teenagers about mountain safety. His method was simple and effective. He would start his talks like a normal person, talking about his experiences of survival and working as a trapper. Then came the moment when he would lift up his pant leg, revealing his prosthesis. This moment always made a strong impression on the audience. Teenagers who thought they were invulnerable suddenly realized that even a seasoned professional could be on the brink of life and death. His story became more than just a warning of danger. It became a lesson about the strength of the human spirit, the importance of never giving up, and that even the worst loss can lead to a new vocation. Now, by sharing his experience, Ken may be saving more lives than he did in all his years as a paramedic. Ken Hildebrand's story is more than a tale of survival. It is a testament to the human spirit's ability to overcome seemingly impossible challenges. Even when alone in extreme conditions, a person can find the strength to fight to the end. What do you think of this story? How would you act if you were in a similar situation? In your opinion, what decisions did Ken make that were most important to his survival? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you like this story, support the video by liking it. It will help more people to learn about this amazing example of human resilience. Subscribe to the channel because every survival story is not just a story, but an invaluable experience that may one day save your life. See you in the next episodes.